My son said, "You don't pay rent, you don't live here." I sent him a notice. The house wasn't his to begin with. I still remember the way the words landed, sharp and practical, like a clipboard placed between us. My son stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his sleeves rolled just so, holding a folded piece of paper as if it were nothing more than a grocery list. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He said it calmly, with the confidence of someone who believed organization was the same thing as authority. "I am Mildred. I am 74 years old." And in that moment, standing barefoot on the cool tile of the house I had lived in for 46 years, I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I have always been a quiet woman. The kind who dries dishes before putting them away, who smooths the corners of towels so they stack evenly. I raised my son here in this very kitchen, where the cabinet hinge still squeaks if you don't lift the door just right. When he moved back in temporarily, he arrived with labeled boxes and polite smiles, promising to help me with groceries, to fix the loose stair rail, to bring order where age had softened my edges. I believed him. Of course I did. Mothers are trained in belief. At first his changes felt helpful. He replaced my old towels with gray ones that matched. He reorganized the drawers, placing my wooden spoon, the one with the burn mark from 1989, into a back compartment I had to kneel to reach. "This makes more sense," he said kindly, as if sense were a universal rule and not a personal history. He framed my photographs into uniform black frames, removing the scalloped edges I loved. "Cleaner," he murmured, adjusting them so they aligned perfectly, while I stood behind him, holding the glass from a picture he had decided no longer fit. The house began to sound different. Drawers closed with a sharper click. The kettle was moved to a new burner, and when I reached for it by habit, my hand grasped air. He replaced my soft dishcloths with sponges that smelled faintly of chemicals. "These sanitize better," he explained. Every sentence began with a reason. Every reason erased something small. At night, I lay awake listening to his footsteps, heavier than they used to be, pacing above me in the room that once held his childhood trophies. I remembered him at 6, running through the hallway in socks, laughing so hard he fell. I remembered painting the walls myself after his father died, choosing a pale yellow because it made the mornings feel forgiving. The walls are still yellow beneath the new coats of white he insists are more modern. The paper he handed me that day was titled simply, "Living Arrangement Agreement." The listed expectations, contributions, rent. He pointed to a line with his pen. "It's only fair," he said, not looking at my face. "If you don't pay rent, you don't live here." Something inside me went very still. I took the paper with hands that have folded 1,000 letters, signed 1,000 permission slips. I felt the grain of it, cheap and thin. I thought of the deed locked away in the old cedar chest upstairs, beneath quilts I stitched when my joints were kinder. He did not know about the clause my late husband insisted on adding, the one that made ownership clear even in death. He did not know because he had never asked. He had mistaken access for entitlement, helpfulness for control. I said nothing then. I have learned that silence, when chosen, can be stronger than protest. That night I climbed the stairs slowly and opened the cedar chest. Though it still smelled like time. I unfolded the documents with care, smoothing them on the bed like fragile fabric. The truth sat there in ink and signatures, patient as it had always been. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. In the morning I made tea the old way with my chipped mug and watched the sunlight return to the yellow walls. The house felt like it was listening. And for the first time since my son came home, I knew something he didn't. The next morning unfolded with an almost painful normalcy. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the sink ticked too loudly. I buttered my toast slowly, careful not to let my hands shake, and listened to my son move about the house with the quiet efficiency of someone convinced he was in charge. He rearranged the mail on the counter, stacking it by size, sliding my handwritten note from Mrs. Callahan beneath a pile of bank statements. I watched without comment. Silence, I reminded myself, is not surrender. It is preparation. He spoke to me that day the way one speaks to a checklist. "I've scheduled a plumber for Thursday," he said, not asking. "Also, we should talk about downsizing some of your things. The hallway closet is cluttered." His tone was gentle, almost affectionate, but his eyes skimmed past me, already editing the room. When I reached for the blue towel after washing my hands, he cleared his throat softly. "The gray ones are for everyday use. The blue ones are old." I dried my hands on my skirt instead. The fabric was familiar. It did not correct me. By afternoon, I climbed the stairs to the spare room that had become his office. He had claimed it quickly, installing a desk, a printer, neat stacks of folders labeled in bold black ink. The door was open and I could see him bent over papers, glasses perched on his nose. He looked so much like his father in that moment that my heart ached. I almost turned back. Almost. But I remembered the folded agreement, the line drawn through my own life as if it were a budgeting error. "Do you need something?" he asked without looking up. "I'm going out for a bit," I said. "I'll be back before dinner." He nodded. "Don't forget your keys. And Mildred," he paused, finally meeting my eyes. "We'll talk about the rent tonight." Outside, the air smelled of damp leaves and exhaust. I drove to the post office, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind clearer than it had been in months. I requested certified copies. I asked questions. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled and slid the envelope toward me. "You're all set," she said. I thanked her, my voice calm, my spine straight. When I returned, the house felt tighter, as if it had been holding its breath. My son had replaced the welcome mat, one I bought with my husband the year we paid off the mortgage, with something thin and synthetic. "It was worn," he explained when he saw me notice. "This one's more durable." I nodded, stepping inside, carrying the envelope like a secret heartbeat. Dinner was quiet. He ate quickly, efficiently, wiping his mouth with a napkin folded just so. I chewed slowly, tasting memories in every bite. Afterward, he placed the agreement on the table between us, smoothing it flat. "We need to be practical," he said. "I'm trying to help you stay independent." I folded my hands in my lap. "Independence," I repeated softly. "Yes. This is about responsibility." He tapped the paper. "If you can't contribute, we'll have to consider alternatives." Alternatives. The word hung in the air, heavy and threatening. I stood, collected the dishes, and washed them in silence. He watched me, perhaps waiting for tears, for pleading. I gave him neither. When the kitchen was clean, I returned to the table and placed the envelope beside his papers. "I have something for you," I said. He frowned, curious now, and opened it. The rustle of paper sounded loud. His eyes moved across the page once, then again. The color drained from his face. "What is this?" he asked. "Totus," I replied gently. "Formal. Legal." He looked up, disbelief flickering into irritation. "You can't be serious." "I am," I said. "Very." He laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "This is my house." I met his gaze, my voice steady. "No, it is not." The room seemed to shift. He stood abruptly, chair scraping. "I've been managing everything. I've been paying for repairs. I reorganized." "You reorganized my life," I said, not raising my voice. "You moved my memories into boxes and called it improvement." He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "You should be grateful." "That," I said, "is where you are mistaken." The confrontation was quiet, almost polite, but every word cut cleanly. I explained the deed, the clause, the years. I spoke of my husband's foresight, of the home that had sheltered us through grief and joy. My son's shoulders sagged as the truth settled in. Control once exposed looks small. "This is my home," I said finally. "You've mistaken hospitality for ownership." He sat down slowly, the confidence drained from him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he nodded once stiffly. I need some time." "So will I," I replied. That night, after he retreated upstairs, I walked through the house, touching the walls, the banister, the door frames. I replaced the blue towel on its hook. I moved the wooden spoon back into the front drawer. The house breathed with me, recognizing its own again. Power does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes with paper, patience, and the quiet certainty of knowing where you belong. The days that followed were marked not by shouting or slammed doors, but by a strange, careful politeness, as if the house itself had imposed new rules. My son spoke to me more softly, choosing his words the way one handles glass, though the edge of resentment still glimmered beneath. He began asking before moving things, pausing in doorways instead of crossing them without notice. Control, when interrupted, often disguises itself as courtesy. I woke early each morning and reclaimed small rituals. I brewed my coffee in the chipped percolator he once suggested replacing. I opened the curtains the way I always had, letting the pale light fall unevenly across the furniture. The house responded with familiarity, the soft creak of the third stair, the faint whistle in the radiator. These sounds had been drowned out by his efficiency. Now they returned like old friends clearing their throats. One afternoon I found him in the hallway holding a box filled with photographs. The uniform black frames lay stacked beside him, neat and lifeless. He looked up as I approached, uncertainty written across his face. I thought, maybe you'd want these back the way they were, he said, gesturing to the loose prints. I studied him for a moment, then nodded. Together we sat on the floor, the carpet pressing into my knees, sorting through years of smiles and shadows. He hesitated over a picture of himself at 10, missing a tooth, arms wrapped around my waist. You kept this? He asked. Of course, I said. I kept all of you. His throat tightened, and for the first time since he returned, I saw something like shame soften his posture. Yet even then I knew this was not the end. Habits built on entitlement do not dissolve overnight. The next shift came quietly with a letter slid beneath my door. I recognized the envelope immediately, his handwriting precise and slanted. Inside, a proposal, revised living arrangements, timelines, expectations. He had softened the language, removed the word rent, replaced it with contribution. He framed it as compromise. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the wooden spoon. Some things do not require an answer right away. Instead, I called an old friend. Margaret had lived 2 streets over since before my son was born. She arrived that afternoon with a pie and a knowing look. We sat at the kitchen table, steam curling between us. He always did like to organize, she said gently. Even as a boy. Yes, I replied. And I always did like to let him. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Not anymore, she said. It wasn't a question. That evening, my son attempted a conversation, hovering near the counter as I chopped vegetables with my reclaimed knife. I just want what's best for you, he said. I worry. I know, I answered. But worry does not grant authority. He flinched, then nodded. I've been thinking about finding my own place, he added as if testing the words. Nearby. That sounds wise, I said, keeping my voice even. Relief can be mistaken for encouragement. The tension eased incrementally. He stopped correcting my methods, stopped replacing items without asking. Still, the air remained charged, like a storm that had passed but left the ground unsettled. I spent my evenings in the living room restoring the space to myself. I returned the old lamp to its corner, its light warm and forgiving. I hung my husband's coat back on its hook, not to mourn but to remember continuity. One night, as rain tapped against the windows, my son joined me on the sofa. He sat stiffly at first, then relaxed, his shoulders dropping. I didn't realize how much this place meant to you, he said quietly. I turned to him, studying the lines that had formed on his face. This place, I said, is where I learned how to be myself. It is not a thing to manage. It is a life to respect. He nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. I thought I was helping. You were, I said. Until you weren't. Silence settled between us, heavy but honest. Outside, the rain softened, the world rinsing itself clean. I felt no triumph, only a steady calm. Power reclaimed is not about winning. It is about alignment. In the weeks that followed, boxes appeared in the hallway again, this time labeled in his hand but carried out with care. He moved slowly, asking permission, thanking me for meals. On his last night, he stood at the door, keys in hand. Thank you, he said, for letting me come back. You were always welcome, I replied. Just not to take over. After he left, I walked through the house one final time, touching each room as if sealing a promise. The walls glowed softly, the yellow finally visible beneath the white. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes from knowing your place in the world. Homes remember. They hold the shape of us long after others forget. And when we stand quietly in our truth, even the loudest misunderstandings learn to listen. The morning after my son moved out, the house woke slowly, as if unsure whether it should stretch or stay still. I made my tea and carried it room to room, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. The silence was not lonely. It was spacious. I opened windows that had been kept shut for energy efficiency, and let the autumn air roll through, lifting the curtains like a held breath finally released. For the first time in months, I rearranged nothing. I let things be where they had always chosen to live. The sugar bowl stayed slightly off-center. The chair by the window remained angled toward the light instead of the television. These were not inefficiencies. They were decisions made long ago by a woman who knew how she liked to exist. I spent that afternoon in the spare room he had turned into an office. Without the hum of the printer and the glow of the monitor, the room looked smaller, gentler. Dust floated in the sunlight. I sat on the edge of the bed and remembered sewing Halloween costumes here, laying fabric across the same surface. In the closet, I found a forgotten box labeled, Taxes 2019 to 2021. I moved it aside and uncovered something else, a shoebox unmarked. Inside were items he had quietly set aside. My husband's watch, the chipped figurine from our first anniversary, the old photo album with pages repaired by tape. Things deemed unnecessary. My hands trembled as I lifted them out, not from anger, but from the realization of how close I had come to losing pieces of myself without ever being asked. That night, I dreamed of my husband standing in the hallway, smiling the way he used to when the house was full of noise. "You kept it," he said simply. I woke with tears on my pillow and a sense of peace settling into my bones. The following week brought visitors. Neighbors who had noticed the moving truck, who asked gently if everything was all right. I told them yes and meant it. Margaret came by again, helping me hang the old photographs back in their uneven frames. "It looks like you again," she said, stepping back. "It always was," I replied. Yet even in restoration, echoes lingered. I caught myself hesitating before opening drawers, wondering briefly if I would be corrected. Old habits of shrinking do not vanish overnight. But each time I opened the drawer anyway. Each time nothing bad happened. Freedom, I was learning, often feels unfamiliar at first. One afternoon, the mail brought another envelope from my son. This one was shorter. No headings. No bullet points. Just words. He apologized, not defensively, not with explanations, but plainly. He wrote about fear, about watching me age and mistaking control for care. He ended with a simple line, "I'm learning." I folded the letter and placed it in the cedar chest, not as evidence but as a marker of change. Weeks passed. Winter edged closer. I baked bread the old way, letting the dough rise on the counter instead of in the optimized spot near the heater. The house smelled alive. I invited friends over again, filling the rooms with laughter and the clink of cups. No one rearranged anything. No one commented on the towels. Then one evening there was a knock at the door. My son stood there, hands empty, eyes unsure. "May I come in?" he asked. "Yes," I said, stepping aside. Hospitality, freely given, is different from obligation. He sat where he always had, on the edge of the armchair, careful not to sprawl. We talked quietly. He told me about his new apartment, about how strange it felt to decide where things went. "I keep wanting to label everything," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "And do you?" I asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Then I stop." Before he left, he paused in the doorway, looking back at the living room. "Feels warm," he said. "It always has," I replied. After he was gone, I turned off the lights and stood in the dark, feeling the shape of the house around me. I understood then that reclaiming space is not just about walls and deeds. It is about allowing yourself to take up room again, to exist without apology. As I went to bed, I thought of all the women who had been taught to make themselves smaller in the name of love. I wish they could stand here, feel this quiet triumph. Because the truth is simple, and it waits patiently for us to remember it. A home is not controlled by the loudest voice, but by the one who knows its heart. Winter settled in with a gentler hand than I expected. Snow came lightly, dusting the porch rails and softening the sharp lines of the world. I watched it from the kitchen window, wrapped in my old cardigan, the one with the loose button my son once suggested replacing. I never did. Some things earn their place by staying. With the cold came time, long afternoons, early evenings, and I found myself lingering in rooms I had rushed through before. I sat at the small desk by the window and opened journals I hadn't touched in years. My handwriting wandered across the pages, looping and uneven, recording grocery lists alongside grief, birthdays alongside apologies. I realized how much of my life had been spent making room for others, shifting myself to the margins without noticing. The house, now fully mine again, began to answer me back. The heater rattled in its familiar way. The floorboards complained exactly where I expected them to. These were not flaws. They were conversations. I spoke aloud sometimes, narrating small tasks just to hear my voice fill the space without interruption. My son visited once a week. Each time he asked before moving a chair, before opening a cabinet. It was a small thing, but it mattered. One afternoon he reached for the gray towels out of habit, then stopped, smiled, and chose the blue ones instead. "These feel more like you," he said. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. We began cooking together again, cautiously at first. He chopped vegetables the way I taught him, uneven but enthusiastic. I noticed how often he watched my hands as if learning them anew. At the table he listened more than he spoke. Control had once filled the silence. Now understanding tried. Still, there were days when the past pressed close. I would open a drawer and remember how it felt to be corrected in my own home. The memory lingered like a bruise, faded but sensitive. On those days I cleaned slowly, deliberately, touching each item as if reassuring both of us of our place. One evening, as we washed dishes side by side, my son broke the quiet. "I didn't realize how much I was erasing you," he said. I kept my eyes on the sink. "Most people don't," I replied. "They call it improvement." He dried his hands, staring at the towel. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of things falling apart." I turned then, meeting his gaze. "Fear doesn't give us the right to take over someone else's life," I said gently. "Even when we love them." He nodded, absorbing the words like medicine. As winter deepened, I found myself stronger in small, unexpected ways. I joined a book club at the library. I rearranged the living room not to reclaim it but because I wanted to. I painted the spare room a soft green, choosing the color without consulting anyone. The decision felt luxurious. One afternoon, a young woman from the neighborhood knocked, asking if I would watch her child for an hour. She looked exhausted, hopeful. I said yes. The house filled with the sound of small feet and questions. When the child left, the echo lingered, warm and bright. I realized then that my home was not just restored, it was open again. My son noticed the changes. "You seemed lighter," he said once. "I am," I replied. I remembered myself. The seasons turned slowly. Snow melted. Light returned. And with it came an invitation from my son. Dinner at his place. "No labels," he joked. I went. His apartment was neat but tentative, as if still waiting for permission to settle. We ate, talked, laughed. When I stood to leave, he hugged me carefully, as if afraid to hold too tightly. Driving home, I felt a quiet pride, not in him but in myself. In the boundary I had drawn without shouting. In the life I had insisted on keeping. That night, I sat in my favorite chair, the one angled toward the window, and watched the moon rise. The house held me steady and sure. There is a particular strength that comes with age, when you stop asking to be allowed and start remembering you already belong. Spring arrived early that year, tiptoeing in before winter had fully packed its bags. I noticed it first in the way the light changed, longer afternoons, softer mornings, and in how the house responded. Windows that had stayed shut for months were opened again, letting in the smell of damp earth and new leaves. I aired out the quilts, shaking them gently over the porch rail, watching dust and memories scatter into the breeze. With the thaw came a desire to tend things. I returned to the garden, kneeling carefully in soil that remembered my hands. The roses my husband planted were still there, stubborn and patient. I pruned them slowly, speaking to them as I always had. Growth, I've learned, responds best to calm attention. My son came by one Saturday with gloves and a shovel, asking if I wanted help. The way he asked mattered more than the help itself. We worked side by side, our shadows stretching across the lawn. At one point he started to move a pot I had set near the fence, then stopped. "Is this where you want it?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "That's where it's happiest." He smiled, nodding, and left it there. Later, as we rested on the steps, he told me about a conversation he'd had with a friend, about parents, about boundaries. "I didn't realize how thin the line is," he said, "between caring and controlling." "It becomes clearer," I replied, "when you've crossed it." That afternoon, while he loaded the tools back into his car, I went upstairs and opened the cedar chest again. I took out the deed, the letters, the photographs. Not because I needed to prove anything anymore, but because I wanted to put them in order, my order. I placed them in a folder labeled simply home. The act felt ceremonial. In the weeks that followed, I began to make plans that had nothing to do with managing or being managed. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. The first day, my hands trembled as I dipped the brush, unsure if I still remembered how to let color move freely. But then the blue spread across the paper, uneven and alive, and something inside me loosened. I painted the house first, not as it was, but as it felt. Warm, slightly crooked, full of light. When I brought the painting home, I hung it in the hallway, right where my son once suggested a mirror would open up the space. The mirror was unnecessary. I already knew what was there. One evening, as I prepared dinner, my son arrived unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway, watching me move with ease through the kitchen. "You look like yourself again," he said. "I never left," I replied. "I just got quieter for a while." We ate together, talking about ordinary things. Afterward, he helped clear the table, placing the dishes carefully, not reorganizing, not improving. Just helping. Before he left, he hesitated. "I've been thinking about selling my place," he said. "Moving farther away. A new start." I studied his face, seeing both the boy he had been and the man he was becoming. "Wherever you go," I said, "make sure you know when to ask." He nodded, understanding passing between us like a shared language. That night, I sat on the porch, listening to the frogs begin their chorus. The neighborhood felt alive, interconnected. I thought of all the years I had spent defining myself through others: wife, mother, caretaker. These roles mattered. They always would. But they were not the sum of me. I was also a woman who owned her space, her time, her voice. As spring deepened, I hosted a small gathering. Friends, neighbors, laughter spilling into the garden. Someone asked how long I'd lived here. "All my life," I said, and meant more than the years. Later, after everyone had gone, I walked through the house, turning off lights, touching door frames. I felt whole, not because everything was perfect, but because it was mine again. There is a quiet revolution that happens when you stop shrinking to keep the peace. It doesn't announce itself. It simply changes the way you stand in your own doorway. By summer, the house had fully remembered itself. The rooms held warmth without heaviness, light without glare. I moved through my days with an unhurried rhythm, no longer anticipating correction or instruction. The simple act of choosing what to wear, where to sit, when to rest, felt like a language I had relearned after years of disuse. The garden flourished. Tomatoes climbed their stakes, unruly and generous. The roses bloomed again, red and unapologetic. I spent my mornings outside, hands in the dirt, the sun on my shoulders. Neighbors waved. Children rode past on bicycles, laughter trailing behind them. Life carried on, and I was no longer standing at its edge. My watercolor class became a weekly anchor. I painted not for display, but for understanding: light through curtains, the curve of a teacup, the quiet dignity of an old chair. One afternoon, our instructor paused behind me, studying my work. "You paint like someone who knows how to wait," she said. I smiled. Waiting had taught me many things. My son's visits grew less frequent but more genuine. When he did come, he stayed present, listening instead of planning. Once he noticed the painting in the hallway and stopped. "Is that the house?" he asked. "It's how it feels to me," I said. He nodded, taking it in. "It looks peaceful." "It is," I replied, "because it's honest." There were still moments when the past tugged at me. I'd catch myself bracing when someone offered help, scanning for strings. But now I recognized the difference between assistance and authority. One respects your center. The other replaces it. Late one afternoon, my son called. His voice was hesitant. "I've been offered a job in another state," he said. "It's a big step." "I'm glad," I said. And I wanted to ask, "Would you be all right?" he added. "On your own." I looked around the living room, the yellow walls, the uneven frames, the blue towel folded over the chair. "I've always been on my own," I said gently. "I just forgot for a while." He laughed softly, a sound lighter than I'd heard in years. "I'll come by before I go," he said. When he did, a week later, we sat on the porch with lemonade, watching the sun dip low. He spoke about his plans, his fears, his hopes. I listened, not to manage but to witness. When it was time for him to leave, he hugged me, this time without caution. "Thank you," he said, "for standing your ground." "Thank you," I replied, "for learning to see it." After he drove away, I stayed outside until the stars came out. The house glowed behind me, steady and sure. I felt no emptiness, only space. That night, I wrote in my journal again, my handwriting slow and deliberate. I wrote about power, how it doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like a woman setting a towel back on its hook. Sometimes it looks like a quiet refusal. Sometimes it looks like a door opened on your own terms. I thought of my mother, of her small kitchen and the way she never sat down until everyone else was fed. I wished I could tell her what I had learned. That peace is not something you earn by disappearing. It is something you claim by staying. As summer stretched on, I hosted another gathering, this time larger. The house filled with voices, music, the clatter of dishes. I moved among my guests with ease, offering food, accepting compliments, saying no when I was tired. No one questioned it. When the last guest left and the night settled in, I stood in the center of the living room, listening to the quiet return. The house felt complete not because it was full but because it was respected. Age has a way of stripping things down to what matters. For me it was this: I did not need to be louder. I needed to be clearer. And in that clarity I found a freedom that no one could organize away. Autumn arrived with its golden light, and the house seemed to inhale it, letting the warmth settle into corners that had long grown stiff with habit. The air smelled of leaves and wood smoke, familiar and forgiving. I spent my mornings in the kitchen, sunlight sliding across the yellow walls, listening to the kettle whistle. It was a sound I had missed, not for its sharpness, but because it marked a rhythm I could follow alone, without interference, without correction. My son's visits had become predictable, but each one carried a new weight of understanding. He no longer entered with the quiet confidence of someone managing a home he believed he could command. Instead, he came softly, asking if I needed help before lifting a hand. One day, as he stacked dishes after lunch, he paused and said, "I almost didn't know where to put this." He gestured to a salad bowl I had used since my wedding day. I smiled. "Wherever it fits best to you now," I said. No judgment, only space. The spare room, once claimed as his office, became mine again entirely. I moved the printer to the basement, keeping only a small table where I could write, sort papers, and sketch when the mood struck. The dust motes floated lazily in the sun, catching in the corners like little stars. I took a deep breath and let the air fill my lungs. This house, my sanctuary, had regained its own rhythm. One afternoon, I decided to tackle the hall closet, a small area that had become a battleground of silent disputes. I found objects carefully boxed by my son, items he had considered unnecessary. Old recipe cards, letters tied in faded ribbons, a stack of postcards from vacations long gone. I handled each item with reverence, remembering the laughter, the grief, the quiet afternoons spent in these rooms. When I found a small brass key tied with a string, my husband's spare, I held it against my chest. These were my possessions, yes, but more importantly, they were my history, and history cannot be corrected, only honored. That evening, as the wind rattled the windows, my son appeared at the door, hesitantly holding a small tray of cookies he had baked. I thought, "Maybe we could have tea together?" he asked. I nodded. It was not the way it had been, not the heavy, imposed routine of the past. It was simple, genuine. We sat in the kitchen, the dim light casting shadows across the walls, sipping tea and talking about everything but rules. Somewhere in the middle of conversation he paused. "I never realized," he said quietly, "how much I tried to remake you into something that wasn't needed." His eyes searched mine, uncertain. "I thought I was helping." "You were," I said. "But helping is not ownership. You cannot care for someone by taking over her life." I saw him absorb the words, not defensively, not dismissively, but fully. It was rare to witness such a small, quiet epiphany in another person, and I felt a surge of calm strength. After he left that night, I walked through the rooms, touching the familiar edges of furniture, feeling the uneven floorboards beneath my feet. The house hummed softly, a pulse matching my own. I opened the cedar chest and placed some of the letters and trinkets back inside, closing it gently. Ownership, I realized, is not about possession. It is about knowing what belongs to you in body, heart, and spirit, and protecting it quietly without fanfare. A week later, I found myself standing in the hallway, watching shadows stretch across the walls as the sun set. I reflected on all that had transpired, the small wars waged over towels and drawers, the slow erosion of authority through microaggressions, the legal notice I had delivered like a quiet spark that ignited understanding. Each moment had shaped a new balance between us, a shared respect forged from confrontation, clarity, and patience. That night, sleep came more peacefully than it had in years. I dreamed not of battles but of light filtering through the curtains, of laughter echoing softly down the hall, of the rhythm of my own breath mingling with the pulse of the house. When I awoke, I felt the weight of years lifted slightly, not because I had triumphed over my son, but because I had remembered my own center, the quiet, steady force that had always been mine. Days passed into weeks, and the house felt alive in a way it had not for decades. I cooked meals with care, not precision. I sat by the window and watched the trees sway, listening to the distant hum of neighbors' lives. The small rituals, the folding of towels, the stacking of dishes, the careful placement of photographs, were no longer chores imposed by expectation but acts of communion with a space that reflected me. One evening, I received a letter from my son. He wrote not of apologies this time but of gratitude. He spoke of lessons learned, of the thin line between love and control, and of his hope that I would continue to live fully in the house that belonged to me. I placed the letter in the cedar chest beside the others, not as proof but as a marker of growth, both his and mine. I realized then that the home, much like life itself, thrives not on rules or decrees, but on respect, memory, and careful attention. To inhabit a space fully is to honor its history, to recognize the people who shaped it, and to move within it with integrity and quiet confidence. My son had learned slowly that his place in my life and in this house was never one of ownership. It was one of connection, choice, and love. And as I sat by the window that night watching the stars emerge, I understood something universal. Authority can be claimed, but belonging must be remembered. The house held me steady and faithful, and I held it back in return. In that balance, I found a peace more profound than victory, a soft, enduring power that no one could take from me. Autumn deepened into early winter, and the house settled into its own quiet rhythm once more. The trees outside had shed nearly all their leaves, leaving bare branches that scratched the sky, and the early sunsets cast long shadows across the living room. I moved through the rooms deliberately, letting my fingers brush along familiar surfaces, the banister my husband had polished, the windowsills worn smooth by decades of sunlight, the chipped mug on the counter where my tea waited each morning. These small rituals had become anchors, reminding me that I belonged here, fully and without apology. My son's visits were now rare, but they carried a new weight of respect. When he arrived, he no longer rearranged anything, no longer attempted to improve or streamline. He simply asked if I needed help and only moved when I agreed. One afternoon, as we cleared the kitchen together after a simple meal of soup and bread, he paused by the sink and asked quietly, "Do you want me to put this away?" I nodded, and together we stacked the dishes, moving slowly and without comment. There was no assertion of authority, only shared presence. I noticed a subtle shift in him. His confidence had softened into humility, his energy focused on learning instead of controlling. The cedar chest remained my sanctuary. I often returned to it, opening it carefully to run my hands over the papers, photographs, and small trinkets I had accumulated over the years. One day, I discovered a small envelope tucked behind the larger deeds and letters. A note my husband had written shortly before he passed, addressed simply to me. I unfolded it with trembling fingers and read his words, his handwriting curling across the page. "This home is yours, Mildred. Guard it, live in it fully, and let no one take more than what you freely give." Tears blurred my vision. For years, I had interpreted his message as gentle counsel, but now it resonated as a command of quiet strength. The house was mine, and the right to live fully within it was non-negotiable. That evening, my son returned with a shy smile and a small box of pastries. He had begun to understand, I realized, that hospitality does not equal ownership. I thought, "Maybe we could have tea," he said almost apologetically. I nodded and poured the tea, steam curling in delicate spirals. We sat together in the kitchen talking about small things, his work, a new book he was reading, the changes in the neighborhood, without mention of rules, rent, or authority. The tension that had once defined our interactions was gone, replaced by something new, quiet, mutual respect. Later, as I washed the dishes, he lingered near the counter, watching the water pool in the sink and the soap bubbles swirl. "I've been thinking about what you said last time," he murmured. "About fear and control. I finally understand." I dried my hands and looked at him. Understanding is only half of it. The other half is practice. I said softly. He nodded, absorbing the words in silence. The days grew shorter and colder, but the warmth in the house was steady. I spent more time in the living room, restoring small items to their rightful places. The wooden spoon back in its front drawer, the old photo albums returned to the shelves, the chipped teacups aligned but not forced into perfection. I realized how much of myself I had reclaimed, not only the physical space but the subtle authority of choice, the right to set the rhythm of my own life. One afternoon, while cleaning the guest bedroom, I stumbled upon a small pile of papers my son had inadvertently left behind. Among them was a draft of his former living arrangement agreement. I studied it carefully, noting the meticulous lists and implied rules, the sections where he had tried to define my life through the lens of obligation. I folded the paper and tucked it into the cedar chest, not in anger, but as a reminder of how far we had both come. That document, once threatening, had become a symbol of growth, proof that confrontation, when handled with patience and clarity, could birth understanding rather than resentment. That night, I sat in my favorite chair by the window, knitting quietly, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. I thought about the journey of the past months, the small wars over towels and drawers, the microaggressions that had gnawed at the edges of my life, the legal notice that had been a quiet spark of clarity. Each confrontation, each decision had led to this equilibrium. The house no longer felt like a battlefield but like a home, fully inhabited by its rightful owner. In the stillness, I reflected on the lessons I had learned. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is the measured placement of a hand, the gentle correction of a misplaced object, the quiet insistence on being seen and respected. Authority without understanding is hollow, but clarity of self, grounded in history and memory, cannot be removed. I realized that power, when exercised with patience and dignity, does not need to be asserted loudly. It simply exists. My son visited one final time before the winter deepened. We sat together on the porch, drinking tea as frost formed delicate patterns on the windows. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "I've learned something important here. Not just about you but about myself." I nodded. "Growth is never easy," I said softly. "It comes through reflection and choice." He looked at me, and for the first time in months I saw no tension in his shoulders, no need to assert control. Only respect and quiet understanding. When he left, I walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the familiar corners that had once been battlegrounds. I paused in the living room, letting my hands linger on the frames of old photographs. The house was full of light, of warmth, of the memory of laughter and love. Every object, every piece of furniture, every corner of this home bore the imprint of my life and my choices. I had reclaimed not only the house itself but my right to move freely, to make decisions, and to exist without apology. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized something profound. The house, much like life, thrives when it is treated with respect, when its history is honored, and when those who inhabit it understand the difference between care and control. My son had learned this lesson slowly and imperfectly, but he had learned it. And I, Mildred, had learned something equally vital. That the quiet assertion of self, the gentle insistence on boundaries, and the calm reclamation of one's space can restore dignity, peace, and love, even in the most complicated of family relationships. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the house settle around me, the gentle hum of its life mingling with my own. For the first time in years, I slept without vigilance, without fear, without the sense of displacement that had haunted me. I was home, fully. And in that quiet triumph, I understood the simplest truth. Belonging is not given, nor is it earned through submission. It is claimed through memory, through respect, and through the steady courage to insist on one's own place in the world. Winter had fully settled by the time I woke one morning with frost tracing delicate patterns across the window panes. The sun was pale but steady, spilling a soft light across the yellow walls, illuminating the imperfections that had become familiar friends. I wrapped myself in my cardigan and made tea, the steam rising like a small celebration of routine reclaimed. Each cup was a meditation, a quiet affirmation that I was here, fully present, in the house that had always belonged to me. My son had called earlier that week, letting me know he had secured a position out of state. He would be moving in a few weeks, and though I felt the bittersweet tug of absence, I also felt relief. Relief that he had finally begun to chart his own path without attempting to reshape mine. When he arrived for the last time before the move, he brought nothing but himself, and we walked through the house together slowly, stopping at familiar corners. He looked at the kitchen cabinets, the shelves where my books leaned at odd angles, the framed photographs, and finally the cedar chest. "You've made it yours again," he said quietly. I nodded. "It was never truly lost," I replied, "just waiting for me to remember." He hesitated, then reached out and touched the edge of a table. "I understand now," he said softly, "that ownership isn't about control. It's about respect for the space, for the history, for the people who built it." His voice was steady, humble. And in that moment, I saw the boy who had once tried to impose order through microaggressions transformed into someone capable of reflection and restraint. Later, we sat in the living room, drinking tea as the afternoon light waned. The warmth of the house wrapped around us, not oppressive but comforting, like a shared memory. He spoke of his plans, what he hoped to achieve, where he might settle, and I listened, offering guidance only when asked, letting him chart his own course. There was no tension, no silent battle for dominance. There was only understanding, earned slowly through confrontation, patience, and the quiet assertion of self. After he left, the house seemed to exhale. I walked through the rooms, touching the familiar edges of furniture and walls, feeling the continuity of life that had been restored. The hall closet, the kitchen drawers, the shelves of photographs, everything was in its rightful place, both physically and emotionally. I realized then that reclaiming a home is not merely about physical space. It is about asserting your right to exist within it fully, to make decisions, and to honor the memories that shape it. That night, I found myself sitting by the window, knitting quietly as the first snow of the season fell. The flakes dusted the garden and the porch rail, settling gently on the chairs where I had once watched my son play as a child. I thought of all the moments that had led to this clarity, the subtle microaggressions, the hidden documents, the small legal notice that had shifted the balance of understanding between us. Each moment had contributed to the slow-burning restoration of not just the house, but my own sense of authority and belonging. Sleep came easily that night, and I dreamed not of confrontation or resentment, but of light and warmth, of laughter echoing through empty hallways, of my hands moving freely through space that belonged wholly to me. I woke with the sun spilling over the yellow walls, and I felt a profound sense of calm. The house, like me, was whole again. In the following days, I continued to live deliberately. I prepared meals with care, allowing myself to linger over chopping vegetables, stirring soup, and setting the table just so. I opened drawers slowly, letting my hands rest on familiar items, remembering the stories each object carried. The small rituals, once fraught with the threat of correction, were now celebrations of continuity and choice. One afternoon, I received a letter from a neighbor, inviting me to a holiday gathering. I accepted, and for the first time in years, I felt the anticipation of shared celebration without anxiety. I cleaned the house not to impress but to honor it. Towels were folded as they always had been, photographs carefully dusted, furniture aligned with gentle attention rather than rigid precision. The house glowed in the afternoon sun, welcoming not only guests but the spirit of life that had always inhabited it. My son called that evening to update me on his move. "It's strange," he said, "to start over, but in a good way. I'm learning to manage my space without trying to control everything around me." I smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "That's the hardest lesson," I replied. "Control is easy to grasp, but respect takes practice." We spoke quietly for some time, sharing memories, hopes, and reflections. When the conversation ended, I felt a deep satisfaction, not triumph, not relief, but the profound peace that comes from knowing that balance has been restored, that understanding has replaced conflict, and that both of us had grown in the process. That night, as I moved through the house turning off lights, I paused in the living room, running my hand along the frames of photographs. I thought of my husband, of the years spent raising my son, of the small battles fought over towels, drawers, and teacups. All of it had led to this moment, calm, dignity, and an enduring sense of home. I sat in my favorite chair by the window, watching the snow settle on the garden, and understood something universal. Belonging is not given, nor is it earned through submission. It is claimed through memory, through respect, and through the steady courage to insist on one's own place in the world. And in that clarity, I felt a quiet, unshakable power, not the loud authority of command, but the enduring strength of self-possession. The house was mine, the history was honored, and the home was alive, carrying with it the echoes of love, patience, and quiet triumph. I closed my eyes, listening to the snow, the hum of the heater, the distant wind, and for the first time in years, I felt entirely, unequivocally at peace. The weeks after my son's departure passed with a gentle, deliberate rhythm. The snow melted slowly, leaving the garden damp and fragrant, the earth soft under my fingers. I spent long mornings in the kitchen, preparing meals without urgency, savoring the process rather than rushing to completion. Each task, kneading dough, chopping vegetables, folding towels, felt like a quiet affirmation of self, a reclaiming of the rituals that had been quietly commandeered during his earlier attempts at control. The house, responsive as always, seemed to exhale around me, each creak of the floorboards a reminder that it had waited patiently for me to remember its rhythm. I began venturing outside more often, taking walks through the neighborhood, greeting neighbors who waved as though they had noticed the subtle shift in my energy. I walked slowly, deliberately, enjoying the sound of my own footsteps on the pavement. My son had left a week ago, and though the absence left a quiet ache, it was the kind of space that allowed me to inhabit my own life fully. There was no tension, no unspoken expectation, only freedom tempered by memory. One afternoon, while tending the garden, I discovered a small wooden box hidden behind the rose bushes. It was old, unassuming, and I realized it must have been placed there decades ago, perhaps by my husband. I opened it carefully, finding letters, small trinkets, and photographs I had forgotten existed. Among them was a folded piece of paper in my husband's handwriting. "This house is yours, Mildred. Guard it, live in it fully, and let no one take more than what you freely give." Tears blurred my vision as I held the paper to my chest. It was both a reminder and a blessing, a quiet charge to protect the sanctuary we had built together. Evenings were spent in the living room, the space now fully restored to its original lived-in warmth. I lit the fireplace on colder nights, the flames casting flickering shadows across the yellow walls. The room seemed to hold memory itself. My husband's laugh, my son's first steps, the quiet tension of days now past. I would sit in my favorite chair, knitting or writing in my journal, occasionally glancing at the photographs that lined the shelves. Each image told a story, a reminder of the life I had built, maintained, and ultimately reclaimed. One day, a letter arrived from my son. His handwriting was careful, deliberate, and the tone was measured. He spoke of his new life, his challenges, and most importantly, his understanding of the lessons he had learned in our home. He acknowledged the subtle ways he had overstepped, the quiet microaggressions he had imposed through seemingly trivial acts, the folding of towels, the repositioning of photos, the silent judgment of my routines. "I am learning," he wrote, "to respect not only the space but the person who inhabits it." I placed the letter in the cedar chest, alongside the documents, photographs, and reminders of our shared history. It was not a victory trophy but a marker of growth, both his and mine. That evening, I walked through the house, running my hands along familiar surfaces, touching the banister, the worn edges of tables, the smooth wood of the drawer handles. The house responded with a quiet warmth, almost sentient in its familiarity. I thought of the confrontation months ago, the legal notice, the formal letters, the small but decisive acts that had shifted the balance of power. All of it had led to this: a home fully mine, inhabited not through conflict but through respect, memory, and deliberate choice. I spent time in the spare room, now fully my own again, arranging papers, opening journals, and touching objects that had once been hidden or questioned. The room was filled with sunlight, and I felt the quiet dignity of reclaiming not just space but the authority to exist freely within it. Each item, each photograph, each letter was a testament to a life lived fully, a life I had refused to allow others to overwrite. Late one afternoon my son called. His voice was softer than before, tinged with humility. "I've been thinking about what you said," he admitted. "About boundaries and respect. I understand now that it isn't about being right or managing things. It's about seeing the person who built them, the life they've lived." I listened, smiling quietly. "Exactly," I said. "It's about recognition and choice, not control." That evening I sat by the window, knitting as the sun dipped low. The house was filled with the soft glow of late afternoon light, shadows stretching across the yellow walls. I thought about the journey of the past months, the subtle tensions, the documents, the notices, the small acts of defiance and assertion. Each moment had led to this equilibrium, A home restored, a son transformed, and a self fully reclaimed. Sleep came that night with a sense of calm I had not felt in years. My dreams were not haunted by the fear of intrusion or the subtle erosion of authority, but by light, warmth, and quiet laughter. I awoke with the sun spilling through the curtains, feeling fully present in a house that had witnessed my journey, my confrontation, and my reclamation. In the following days, I continued to live deliberately. I cooked meals, tended the garden, and arranged objects as I pleased. The house responded, not merely as a structure but as a living repository of memory, love, and respect. Visitors were welcomed not into a space of tension but into a home filled with warmth, openness, and authenticity. One morning I realized that the house, much like life itself, thrives on respect, memory, and attention. Control is hollow without understanding. Authority without reflection is brittle. The letters, photographs, and small artifacts of my family's life stood as proof not of ownership alone, but of care, history, and deliberate presence. I had claimed my place gently but firmly, and in doing so restored not only my home but my dignity. That night, as I prepared for bed, I walked through each room, touching familiar surfaces, breathing in the quiet of a life fully restored. The house hummed softly, steady and faithful, and I understood something profound. Belonging is not a gift given nor a favor earned. It is remembered, honored, and defended not through force but through quiet courage, patience, and the gentle assertion of self. I sat in my favorite chair by the window one last time before sleep, looking out at the stars beginning to emerge. The house was alive, warm, and welcoming, filled with echoes of love, patience, and endurance. In the soft glow of the evening, I felt a quiet, enduring triumph, not loud, not triumphant in the conventional sense, but powerful in its quiet certainty. I was home, fully and completely, and nothing, not time nor ambition nor misunderstanding, could take that from me. And in that quiet moment I understood a universal truth. The spaces we inhabit, the objects we touch, the memories we guard, they are extensions of our very being. Protecting them with dignity, patience, and care is the truest form of strength. And reclaiming what is rightly ours brings a peace that no authority or entitlement can ever replicate. The first hints of spring returned slowly, teasing the garden with small green shoots that pushed up through the softened earth. I stood at the kitchen window one morning, cradling a cup of tea, watching the sunlight stretch across the yellow walls. It struck me how much the house seemed to breathe with me, every corner and surface resonating with memory and reclamation. The rooms were no longer merely spaces I occupied. They were extensions of my very being, reflections of choices made, battles quietly won, and dignity restored. I moved through each room deliberately, feeling the familiar textures beneath my fingers. The smooth wood of the dining table, worn by decades of meals shared and stories told. The soft, fraying edges of the living room carpet. The chipped mugs lined neatly in the cupboard. Every object carried its own history, a life threaded through mine, and each was now honored exactly as it had been intended. I no longer anticipated intrusion or correction. The house had become a sanctuary, a place where presence, memory, and care intersected, allowing me to exist fully and unreservedly. My son had moved months ago, settling into his own apartment, and our relationship had transformed into one of quiet respect and understanding. Letters and phone calls replaced visits, each conversation deliberate, thoughtful, and devoid of tension. He wrote about his new life, his challenges, and his reflections on the lessons he had learned in our home. I listened without judgment, offering advice only when asked, allowing him the space to navigate adulthood without imposing control. The shift was subtle but profound. He had finally understood that care does not equate to authority, and that respect for another's life and choices is far more powerful than any attempt to manage them. One afternoon, as I tended the garden, I found myself smiling at the small shoots of tulips and daffodils that had pushed through the soil. My hands, earthy and worn, moved over the plants with the care of someone who knew the value of patience. I realized that tending the garden mirrored the process I had undergone over the past year, nurturing growth, letting go of what no longer served, and allowing life to flourish without unnecessary interference. My home, like the garden, had been restored not through confrontation alone, but through careful attention, respect, and the courage to claim what was rightfully mine. The living room, once a stage for subtle battles over towels, photos, and furniture placement, had become a place of peace and reflection. I often sat in my favorite chair by the window, knitting or writing, listening to the hum of life outside and the quiet pulse of the house around me. The photographs lining the walls, old family portraits, candid snapshots, images of friends long past, served as reminders of the life I had built and maintained. They were not just decorations. They were proof of endurance, love, and quiet triumph. One evening, I received a letter from my son. His handwriting was careful, measured, carrying a tone of reflection rather than apology. He spoke of his growth, the lessons he had learned about boundaries, respect, and the subtle ways in which control can erode trust. "I understand now," he wrote, "that to care for someone is never to take over their life. I am learning to honor the spaces, memories, and choices that belong to others, just as you have taught me." I placed the letter in the cedar chest alongside the other documents, photographs, and reminders of our shared history. It was not a trophy but a testament to growth, understanding, and the restoration of trust. As the days grew longer and the air warmer, I began preparing the house for spring. Windows were opened wide, allowing the fresh air to sweep through every room. I cleaned slowly, deliberately, touching each object as I moved it, acknowledging its history, its place, and its significance. The act of caring for my home had become a meditation, a practice of presence and appreciation. The house no longer felt like a battleground, nor a space to be defended. It was a living entity that reflected the life within it. One afternoon, I sat by the window sipping tea and reflected on the journey of the past months. The confrontation with my son, the legal notice, the subtle microaggressions, all of it had led to this equilibrium. I had reclaimed not only my home but my voice, my authority, and my dignity. I had learned that true power does not need to be loud or aggressive. It exists quietly, patiently, and with unwavering clarity. By insisting on my right to inhabit my own life fully, I had restored not just my house, but the sense of self that had been obscured by fear, habit, and misplaced deference. The first guests of spring arrived one evening, friends and neighbors, invited to share a simple meal. The house, bathed in the golden light of sunset, welcomed them warmly. Laughter and conversation flowed freely, unencumbered by the weight of past tensions. I moved among them with ease, offering food, stories, and gentle attention, fully present and unburdened. The rituals of hospitality were no longer a means of appeasement or performance. They were expressions of connection, generosity, and the life I had chosen to claim. After the gathering, when the house had quieted and the last guest had departed, I walked through each room, touching the familiar edges of furniture, the smooth wood of the banister, the uneven frames of photographs. Each corner, each object, each shadow felt like a part of me woven into the fabric of my being. I paused in the living room, gazing at the space bathed in moonlight, and understood fully the depth of what had been restored. The house, my sanctuary, was alive, vibrant, and entirely mine, not just by law but by memory, attention, and care. That night, as I prepared for bed, I reflected on the lessons of the past year. Strength, I realized, does not always roar. It is often quiet, patient, and persistent. Authority is not imposed through domination but recognized through clarity, boundaries, and respect. Belonging is not given, it is remembered, claimed, and protected with the gentle courage of a life fully lived. I felt the weight of this understanding settle within me, steady and enduring. I closed my eyes in my favorite chair one final time before sleep, listening to the subtle hum of the house, the distant whisper of the wind through the trees, and the soft echo of my own heartbeat. I was home wholly and unapologetically. Every object, every shadow, every memory affirmed my presence. The house was alive with the history of my life, the choices I had made, and the dignity I had reclaimed. And in that quiet, luminous moment, I understood a truth that reaches far beyond any one house, any one family, any one life. True belonging is not earned through submission or taken through force. It is claimed through memory, honored through respect, and protected through the steady, patient courage to insist upon one's rightful place in the world. In that realization, I felt complete, whole, and infinitely at peace. The home, finally, reflected not only my life but the enduring strength of a woman who remembered herself and refused to yield.